Why 3 Tudor children had to die before Henry VIII became king. Before Henry VIII ever wore a crown, 3 Tudor children were already dead, and their deaths were not accidents. They were the price of survival. When people think of the Tudors, they think of Henry VIII and his 6 wives, or the power and spectacle of Elizabeth I. But before any of that, in the 1490s and early 1500s, 3 royal children, born to Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, died quietly inside the royal nursery before they ever had a chance to matter. Their births were recorded, their deaths acknowledged, and then their names slowly slipped out of memory. And that is the first uncomfortable truth. They were not forgotten because they were unimportant. They were forgotten because they were dangerous to a fragile dynasty. These deaths were not just private family tragedies. They came at a moment when the Tudor crown was barely a decade old, still threatened by pretenders and uncertainty. Every child was meant to secure the throne, and yet, one by one, those children disappeared. Some were buried with extraordinary ceremony, others without even a visible grave. Which raises a troubling question. Who decides which royal child deserves to be remembered, and which one must quietly vanish? And if the Tudor dynasty depended on heirs to survive, then why did it begin with 3 small deaths that history would rather not explain? The Tudor dynasty began in January 1486, when Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, a union meant to heal a country still scarred by civil war. Their first son, Arthur, arrived that September, followed over the next 16 years by 6 more children: Margaret in 1489, Henry in 1491, Elizabeth in 1492, Mary in 1496, Edmund in 1499, and finally Catherine in 1503. There were later rumors of another boy named Edward, but those stories collapse under scrutiny. They appear to be nothing more than a confusion with Edmund's name. On paper, this looked like dynastic success. A growing family, a secured crown, but numbers can deceive. Because in a dynasty this young, children were never just children. Each birth was a public statement, proof that the Tudors belonged on the throne. And that is where the quiet danger begins. When legitimacy depends on surviving offspring, childhood becomes political, and death stops being private. The first losses did not come in battle, or rebellion, or exile. They came inside the nursery, the safest space a royal child was supposed to know. And they came early. So early that some of these children never met each other at all. Their lives overlapped on parchment, not in memory. What history often overlooks is that this pattern of loss began long before Henry VIII ever ruled, long before his marriages or his obsessions. The instability was already there, embedded in the family itself. And the most unsettling part is not how many children were born, but which ones history chose to remember. Because the first child to die was not a son, not an heir, not a political rival. It was a little girl named Elizabeth, and yet she would be mourned in a way that made her death echo far beyond her short life. So the question becomes unavoidable. Why did the Tudor dynasty choose to turn one child's death into a public monument, and quietly allow the others to fade into silence? Princess Elizabeth was born on July 2nd, 1492, at the Palace of Sheen, later renamed Richmond. She entered the royal nursery almost immediately, joining her older sister Margaret and her brother Henry, who was close to her in age. Arthur, the eldest, lived separately with his own household. Elizabeth was cared for by a nurse named Cecily Burbage, paid £10 a year, a respectable sum for tending a royal child. There is little recorded about Elizabeth's short life, but given her age and proximity to Henry, she was likely his earliest companion, not in politics, but in play. And that detail matters, because it reminds us how ordinary her beginnings were. Then, on September 14th, 1495, at Eltham Palace, Elizabeth died. She was 3 years old. No cause was recorded. There are no accounts of a long illness. No warnings, which suggests something sudden. And in a court obsessed with record-keeping, that silence is striking. A child disappears, and the documents move on. But the response that followed makes it clear that this death was never meant to be quiet. Elizabeth's body was embalmed, wrapped in cerecloth, and placed in a coffin, seared and chested, as later described. She lay in the chapel for around 11 days. Every single day, dirige and a mass of requiem were sung over her body. A cloth of gold covered the coffin. Her arms were displayed in gold lozenges around the chapel. There was a black-draped funeral chair drawn by 6 horses, a canopy for banners, the Trinity, Our Lady, St. George, and the King's Arms. This was not the farewell of a private child. It was a public spectacle. Her body was carried to Westminster, received by the prior and convent of the abbey, and placed in the choir beneath a hearse, with black sarcenet trimmed in red and white roses and gold lettering declaring, Jesus est amor meus. She was buried to the right of the altar, just before the shrine of Edward the Confessor among kings. A small altar tomb of black marble was erected, inlaid with brass. A gilded copper effigy lay atop it, later stolen. The epitaph recorded her birth and death. The funeral alone cost £318, a vast sum, not even counting the memorial itself. This is the moment where the story turns uncomfortable, because love alone does not explain this level of display. The Tudor dynasty was barely a decade old. Threats still existed, pretenders still circulated, and nothing projects legitimacy like burying your dead child among England's kings. Elizabeth's death became a statement, a declaration that this family belonged where it stood, which leads to the question history rarely asks. If this was grief, why was it so carefully staged? And if this was politics, why was this honor reserved for a 3-year-old girl, when later a royal son would die without even a visible grave? In the summer of 1498, Elizabeth of York realized she was pregnant again. By February 21st, 1499, at around 6 in the evening according to later accounts, she gave birth at Greenwich to a son, Prince Edmund. Even before the child arrived, the machinery of dynasty was already in motion. The baptismal font was urgently summoned from Canterbury while Elizabeth was still in labor. A man named John Davy was paid 6 shillings and 8 pence to ride for it, and further rewards were distributed to ensure its delivery. This was not sentiment. This was preparation. A male child meant stability, and stability could not wait. 3 days later, Edmund was baptized at the Church of the Grey Friars in Greenwich. His godfathers were powerful men, the Duke of Buckingham and the Bishop of Durham. His godmother was his paternal grandmother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, who held him at the font herself. Edmund was given the title Duke of Somerset and sent to the royal nursery, where he was cared for by a wet nurse named Alice Skerne, the same woman who had tended his sister Mary. Everything about Edmund's arrival suggested intention and hope. A son had been produced, a safeguard had been added, and for a brief moment, the Tudor future looked less fragile. But Edmund's life would be even shorter than his sister Elizabeth's. At around 15 months old, he died at Bishop's Hatfield in Hertfordshire. As with Elizabeth, no cause of death is recorded. What remains instead is accounting. A payment of £242 11/8d was made for the burial of my Lord Edmund. He was buried at Westminster Abbey, placed in the chapel of Edward the Confessor, the same sacred space where Elizabeth had been laid to rest. The date of his death is usually given as June 19th, 1500, yet the burial payment appears in accounts dated May, raising the possibility of clerical error or confusion, a small uncertainty that only deepens the sense of quiet disappearance. And then there is the silence that follows. Unlike Elizabeth, Edmund was given no monument, no altar tomb, no effigy, no marked resting place we can identify today. For a society that valued male heirs above all else, this absence is difficult to explain. A royal son dies, and yet he leaves almost no physical trace behind. This is where the story turns sharply, because Edmund's death carried more dynastic weight than Elizabeth's ever could have. Had he lived, he would have been a second male heir, either a rival to Henry VIII or a reassurance that the crown would survive even if Henry failed to produce a son. His existence alone might have changed everything that followed. Instead, Edmund vanished from view, and with him vanished the safety net of the Tudor line, which raises the next question the records never answer. When this boy died and left no mark behind, what pressure did that place on the woman expected to produce the next heir, and what would it ultimately cost her to try? In November 1501, the Tudor dynasty appeared to be secure. Prince Arthur, the long-awaited heir, married Catherine of Aragon in a ceremony meant to signal permanence and stability. But less than 5 months later, in April 1502, Arthur was dead at Ludlow Castle. He was 15 years old. With his death, The entire Tudor future collapsed onto a single surviving boy, Prince Henry. What had looked like abundance suddenly revealed itself as fragility. Henry VII and Elizabeth of York were devastated, but devastation could not be indulged for long. The crown did not grieve the way ordinary families did. Elizabeth understood the danger immediately. According to later accounts, she comforted her husband by reminding him that they were still young enough to have more children, which, in the language of the time, meant more sons. Within months, she was pregnant again. This was not hope. It was necessity. By December 13th, a relic known as Our Lady's Girdle was brought to Elizabeth, believed to aid women in childbirth. On January 26th, she began her confinement at the Tower of London, then still a royal residence, not yet the symbol of imprisonment it would become. The setting matters. This was not a private chamber chosen for comfort. It was a fortified space, heavy with authority, chosen because the survival of the dynasty now depended on what happened inside it. On February 2nd, Elizabeth gave birth with the assistance of her long-trusted midwife, Alice Massey. The child was a girl, Princess Catherine. That alone may have been a disappointment. But disappointment was not the disaster. The disaster came after. Elizabeth did not recover. Day by day, the woman who had given the Tudors legitimacy through her blood and her body grew weaker. And then, on February 11th, 1503, her 37th birthday, Elizabeth of York died. The timing is impossible to ignore. The queen who had been asked to save the dynasty with her body died on the very day she marked another year of her life. And the child she had produced in that final effort did not survive her. Catherine was still alive on February 12th, when 4 yards of flannel were purchased for her. Shortly after, she died as well. No exact date is recorded. Polydore Virgil would later write only that the child lived a few days. Sandford would phrase it more gently, saying she was called unto a far better kingdom. What neither provides is clarity. The records simply stop. Catherine was buried at Westminster Abbey, like her siblings. But unlike Elizabeth, she was given no memorial, no monument, no visible place of remembrance. She was not buried with her mother. Mother and child separated even in death. For a family that had spent enormous sums and ceremony projecting unity and legitimacy, this absence is unsettling. This is the moment when Tudor power reveals its cost. Childbirth was no longer a domestic event. It was a political act. Relics were summoned. Rooms were secured. Midwives were deployed. Everything was arranged to keep the crown alive. And yet, the system consumed the very woman who made it possible. Elizabeth of York did exactly what was expected of her, and it killed her. For the Tudor dynasty, her death was catastrophic. She was the bridge between warring houses, the living proof of reconciliation. Without her, the throne lost its soft power, its moral anchor. And for her surviving son, Henry, the lesson was carved early and deeply. A crown could be gained through marriage. It could be protected through heirs, and it could be placed in mortal danger by a single failed birth. So when Henry VIII later became obsessed with producing a legitimate son, the question is not whether he was cruel or calculating. The question is simpler and darker. Was he chasing ambition, or was he haunted by the memory of a mother and sister who died because one child was never enough? Of all Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's children, only Princess Elizabeth was given a visible grave memorial. The others faded into architectural silence. But there was one attempt to gather them all again, not in stone, but in paint. Sometime between 1503 and Henry VII's death in 1509, a painting was commissioned, likely intended as an altarpiece, executed in the Flemish style. It does something unusual. It refuses to accept the nursery as the end of the story. In the painting, Henry VII stands on the left, flanked by his 3 sons, Arthur, Henry, and Edmund. Elizabeth of York stands on the right with their 4 daughters, Margaret, Elizabeth, Mary, and Catherine. Every child is shown not as an infant or a corpse, but as a young adult. They wear robes. They wear crowns and costly pendants. Their hands are clasped in prayer. This is not how they lived. This is how they are remembered, or how the dynasty needed them to be remembered. An angel stands between the male and female halves of the family, marking a quiet division that feels deliberate. In the background, St. George slays the dragon, while a fictional princess he protects holds a lamb, a symbol of innocence. The message is layered, careful, and restrained. On the surface, it is dynastic imagery, order, continuity, divine favor. But beneath it lies something more unsettling. Children who never reach childhood are granted adulthood in paint, as if history itself could be corrected by composition. This is often described as a political object, a dynastic instrument designed to strengthen the Tudor image. And that reading is not wrong, but it is incomplete, because no monument was raised for Edmund. No stone marked Catherine's resting place. If this was only propaganda, simpler methods were available. Instead, the dynasty chose to preserve its lost children in a form that blurred memory and wish, grief and authority. The painting does not show absence. It denies it. It insists that the family was whole, even when it was not. And in doing so, it reveals something that stone monuments do not. Henry VII may have been cautious, calculating, even cold by reputation. But this image suggests that forgetting was not the same as not caring. Some names were erased from physical space, yet held tightly in symbolic form. For Henry VIII, growing up in the shadow of this image, the effect must have been unavoidable. Brothers and sisters he never truly knew stood beside him as equals, crowned and complete. The painting offered no explanation for why some survived and others vanished. It only presented the result, a family defined as much by who was missing as by who remained. And that brings the story back to its most difficult question. If memory could be preserved in paint but denied in stone, then remembrance itself was a choice. Princess Elizabeth was given a tomb. Edmund and Catherine were not. So who, in the Tudor world, decided which child deserved permanence, and which name could quietly be allowed to dissolve into history? 3 children, 3 deaths, and a dynasty still learning how to stand, propped up by ceremony, gold cloth, black marble, and graves placed exactly where they needed to be seen. But what lingers in the shadows is not grandeur. It is absence. The nursery remained staffed. Wet nurses were still paid. Flannel was still purchased. Baptisms were still prepared. And then, abruptly, everything stopped. History remembers the Tudors through marriages and executions, through power struggles and broken queens. But before any of that, there were the quieter tragedies, the deaths of children who never lived long enough to become symbols. A 3-year-old girl buried like a queen, a royal son who vanished without a monument, a newborn who survived only days, dying shortly after her mother, on the queen's own birthday. And in the center of it all stood one surviving boy, Henry, growing up surrounded not just by privilege, but by loss, by siblings who existed on parchment, in ritual, and in paint, but not in life. Long before he wore a crown, he learned that survival in this family was never guaranteed, and that legitimacy could be lost as easily as it was gained. We will never know what truly happened inside those nursery rooms. The records fall silent where emotion would begin. What we do know is this: the Tudor dynasty was not secured by triumph alone. It was stabilized through loss, through deaths that were transformed into proof. Proof of belonging, proof of authority, proof that this family deserved to rule. And that leaves one final question hanging unresolved. In a world where memory itself was carefully managed, where some children were immortalized and others erased, who decided the price of legitimacy, and who, in the end, was allowed to be remembered?